All right, well, then let's move on. Thank you guys for being back. Thanks for giving us your time again this week. And I'm excited to have a chance to hop into the book of James with you tonight. We're going to, or at least my plan is to kind of jump into the book of James as we go, maybe talk about or bring up some of the things we talked about last week. But hopefully, as we move through the passage that we'll tackle tonight, we'll just have a chance to kind of model and think through how we're gonna go about doing this. So tonight, I'm hoping to cover about James chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. So I think we can do that, and I think we should probably just hop right in. I think James is one of those books, probably because of the history of its interpretation. It has some difficulties involved in it. One of the more famous ones is where in James chapter 2 verse 4 it seems like James is disagreeing with Paul a little bit. James says you're saved by you're saved by works and not faith alone. And of course Paul says actually you're saved by faith, not works. And so that's been a bit troublesome. I think James also has been it's a little bit difficult to read. Interpreters have really struggled with it over the years. In fact, one of the things that a lot of people have noticed is it seems a little bit hard to follow sometimes. And so some of the people that have interpreted have just said James is just a string of unrelated kind of chunks of wisdom that just kind of got thrown together in a book. And so it's not entirely straightforward. And so I want to help us think through how some of the things we know, or at least some of the assumptions that we can make about James, maybe can help us get a sense of what James was doing, why he was writing, who he was writing to, and we'll try and see if we can use that for a little bit of guidance and help us make sense of how James, in my estimation, in my mind, how James actually starts and has a very clear flow. One of the things that I think we'll see tonight, just to mention, it's something worth remembering when you read, and I think it's one of the things that's caused a lot of Western interpreters to think about, is that James, most Eastern writers from Eastern cultures, they write in circles, right? So you say something and you talk about it a bit and you come back to almost the same thing and you go around in spirals. And so sometimes that can give us trouble because it's those points that you come back to that are important. But for Western people, that's not how you were taught to write a research paper, right? You were taught to write and you do a point and then you go to the next one, you go to the next one, and you go to the next one, and you move through your points and you come to the end. And so sometimes that going around and around throws us off a little bit when we try and do outlines. So let's hop into James and see if we can see other clues or find other ways to think about what he's trying to say. The first thing is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to tell you who James is, who the author is. Nobody knows. And anybody that tells you that they know is bluffing just a tiny bit, all right? We have ideas. So for my purposes tonight, I think we're just going to go with the tradition, which is the brother of James. There are lots of arguments for and against. We'll go with that. The audience, we're not entirely sure either. So if you look at James chapter 1, it says the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And so people have ranged from very Jewish churches all the way to 12 tribes in the dispersion, meaning the tribes that went out, that's actually standing for Gentile churches who are just in a situation of being like dispersed. I'm going to go with, and I tend to think because of the way James is written, that James is actually written to Jewish people or people with a solid Jewish background who are going to resonate with Jewish styles of teaching, who are going to resonate with Jewish literature. And I've already hinted at that when I talked last week a little bit about the fact that I think James is wisdom literature, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the audience, we're not entirely sure, but there are some things that we can know from our understanding of history and then from some of the things that we pick up in the book. For example, it seems if you read all the way through the book, our very first the second verse, but really when we start into the meat of the chapter, talks about when you meet with trials, right? And so there are all kinds of other indications in like chapter 4 and chapter 5 where James mentions again being steadfast, patient, hang on when there are trials and things like that. So we get the sense that very likely from what we know of early churches and then from what we know of the Jewish experience out in the broader culture, it's very likely that these were people who were heavily marginalized, all right? People who were, to use modern terms, in a lower socioeconomic class. They were people probably struggling. They would have been people that were most likely looked down on because of their Jewishness. And as Christians, they were most likely rejected because of their Christianness, right? The Christians, sometimes we forget this, is that the early Christians were sort of outcasts from everybody. And so for Jewish people that had come up in a faith tradition that was so strong and rooted, and then to turn their back on that tradition and say, yeah, we're going to follow some criminal on the cross, that was often very difficult for them. You remember even in the New Testament, Luke and Acts, Acts mostly, written by Luke, we start to see them, they were getting kicked out of synagogues, the places of worship. They were stuck on the outside. And so it's not a very big stretch to think that they were marginalized. The second thing that it might be good for us to remember is, while we might lament in America today that we've got an issue with money and commercialism and what's the word I'm looking for? Consumerism, things like that, where you spend money, you need to have things. Riches and wealth meant something different back in the time of these people. In fact, it means something different in a lot of other countries. Where I lived in Thailand is actually very similar to what we seem to feel like riches meant back in the day. So everybody knows that there are rich people that are corrupt and that are unjust and that steal, and yet within some of these cultures, typically within Eastern cultures today, riches still at the very bottom. The good life says something about you being in with the spiritual powers that be. All right, so riches are not just, holy cow, I wish I had all that stuff. For a lot of these cultures, riches also suggest that you're doing something right. All right, and so you look up for that. The world is working for you. All right, and we might have that to some degree, but it's strong, and it's when you're living the good life. That's not just, oh, I wish I had what that person had. It's also a sign of that person's nailing it. All right, in terms of even often with a spiritual overtone. That person is doing what's right to get the universe to pony up for them. Okay? So that's another aspect that we'll factor in. Not so, well, actually it starts tonight, but in other chapters in James it's going to be very important. Secondly, just to kind of flesh out the cultural situation, these people lived in what's called, I guess, sociology, or in some other studies, in what's called a patron-client society. And you don't have to remember that, but what that means is poor people, the people on the bottom, need a rich person to be your friend for your livelihood, right? And we kind of know a patron of the arts or clients of the arts. That it's that kind of thing. It's where you have groups of people. The way that by and large, the way as a poor person or as a poor man typically that you would get a job is you go and you find someone to get work. And in a lot of poor countries, you actually still see this. People stand on a street corner and somebody will drive by. Actually, I shouldn't say poor countries. I think it actually happens a lot in our country too. The idea of the workers stand on the corner and there's no workman's comp. There's no nothing. You just drive up and say, I need so many guys. You're going to do this today. Remember the parable of, in the Gospels, the parable of the workers that a bunch of them worked all day. Some of them worked half and they all got, it's that kind of a thing. You go, and so your livelihood, your chance of success is tied to someone who has wealth. It's tied to someone the richest. And so riches play a significant, I'm going to use the biblical term riches, I guess. Wealth and being successful plays a significant role in these people's lives. And so we'll keep that in mind as we start to head through in James. Second thing to remember is, and one of the last things that I want to say before we start to wrap up is just remember, I think it's really hard for us, those of us that are in church, those of us especially, for those of us that have been Christians for a long time, it's hard for us to remember what it will be like. We're talking by the kind of the best estimates of dating that James would have been written about 20 years after Christ. Right? So you think about it, we're the product of 2,000 years, roughly, of wrangling with the significance of the gospel, with all of these things, of studying the scriptures, right? There were no gospels. In fact, there was no New Testament, we can almost guarantee, at that point. Paul had not written his letters yet, maybe one or two if we're lucky. There was no spiritual network. We had Paul, but as churches begin to grow, there was nothing like the culture that we have, especially here in Western Christian nations, the culture in which Christianity is, while we might lament it's not as significant as it could be, Christianity is sort of in the air. And so for them, these are people that are there. And so I'm suggesting that the audience of James that James is writing not to a group of people like us to lay out in detail the mechanics or all of the theology of how you live every day in your life. I'm going to argue that James was written as an exhortation largely to a group of people who are starting to wonder, let's say, if they made the right choice. Did we actually do the right thing when we said, let's go with Jesus? Let's become outcasts for this, and we don't have good jobs. Everyone else is successful. All of this other stuff is going on. And so I'm going to suggest that we'll keep that in our mind as we think. James is writing to people who are, I would say, at the very least, beginning to encounter those kind of things that say, can we keep doing this? Can we keep going in this trajectory that's not working out for us? All right, so let's keep that in the back of our minds, and I'll refer to that as we go through. Hopefully we'll do maybe at least another sermon. I'd like to do at least 2 to kind of help us see how James's argument runs through these chapters. The second thing I want to do is just a reminder is I also think that the wisdom, or James is what's called, and again, you don't try and remember these terms, wisdom, genre, etc., etc. You can remember wisdom because it's worth thinking about what wisdom is. But basically, James is written in a style of writing which is growing out of the idea, how do you live in a world that doesn't seem to make sense, that seems like you've made the wrong choice, that's unpredictable, that doesn't seem to always work out the way you want it to be, all right? And so, for example, the books that we consider this are like Job, right? You remember if there was ever a person that had troubles and was wondering what happened, it's Job. Ecclesiastes is a bit like that, right? It says everything is ethereal, nothing seems to make sense. It goes on and that talks about how you work there. And then Proverbs is another one. And so I think you could put quote unquote wisdom books on a bit of a seesaw, right? So you have Job, and Habakkuk would be another one. I don't know if you've read Habakkuk for a while, but Habakkuk is one where Habakkuk was all getting all up in God's business about taking care of things and taking care of all the bad people, and God said, well, actually the bad people are going to win for a while, and Habakkuk basically freaked out, and God said, bad things are going to happen. You need to just basically deal with it. So Habakkuk is on the spectrum. It's on the side of the teeter-totter with James. With Job. Proverbs is the far end of the spectrum, and I believe Proverbs is not so much a manual of how you do things so you can figure out all of your life. I would suggest to you that Proverbs in this framework of wisdom is more, what are the things that you can do to eliminate as much uncertainty as possible, right? So for example, how can you can't control the world, you can't control everything that happens to you, but there are things that you can do, there are habits that you can build up, there are ways that you can think that can eliminate a lot of self-harm, let's put it that way. For example, one of my favorite Proverbs says, don't grab a stray dog by the ears, lest you get bitten, right? So the idea is, okay, you might be walking down the street and a stray dog might come up and bite you on the back of the leg. But you know, if you never grab one by the ears, you'll never get bitten by that dog, right? So you're eliminating, you're not saying I'll never be bitten by a stray dog, but what you're saying is, here are some things I can do so that I can at least not cause my own problems, okay? Try and eliminate those things that you're doing to yourself or others around you. And so wisdom, I would argue, then that's how it fits into that. In this kind of world, how do you begin to find as much stability as you can or eliminate as much of that? I am going to suggest that James comes somewhere in the middle of those two spectrum, that James is not purely, I'm going to say theoretical like Job. I don't think Job is theoretical, but James is not dealing simply with that big question, what happens when God does stuff that you don't understand? But it's not nearly as practical as Proverbs. And I think James is going to sit in the middle there, and it's going to build. James is going to riff on that idea of the world is a crazy place, and then he's going to offer us examples to show us how do we think about that when we, in this situation, when we commit to God in trust? How do we begin to think through that? What does it mean for us as we live our daily lives? All right? So with those things in mind, let's go ahead and start with James. We're going to start with the big picture. I'm going to start with the forest, I think, and then hopefully we'll get on to the trees in chapter 1. So I'm going to suggest that the forest, or the big picture that James is trying to do, that James's book is built on getting you as a Christian, or maybe I should say, last week I said it wasn't written. James's book is built on getting those first century Jewish Christians, and through them you, It's built on getting them to get a sense of God's goodness and a sense of the character of God that will anchor them as they begin to navigate their way through this world that we're just talking about. So I'm going to suggest, even though God's goodness doesn't necessarily come up as the word in the book of James, I'm going to suggest that chapter 1, as James moves towards the idea of how do we stay stable and trusting in this world, he's going to found it, or he's going to build on top of God's goodness. So just an example of where we're going, where the book of James ends up. You don't have to go there necessarily, but James chapter 5 verse 7, guess who gets mentioned there? James chapter 5 verse 7, or actually basically chapter 5, but Job shows up as the model of what James is looking for. So at the very end of the book, James starts somewhere and brings us around to Job. And you remember we just talked about Job. He mentions towards the end of the book in chapter 5, towards the end there, he talks about, actually chapter 4 and 5, but as we're wrapping up the book, he talks about don't give oaths, don't make oaths. He says don't make these silly promises. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, right? Why? Because you actually don't have the control that's necessary to make an oath, right? You can say, I swear I will do. I swear I will run a marathon, and then you might lose both of your legs in a car wreck, right? All of these kinds of things. And so the idea becomes simply live, simply, and I will argue, simply trust, move your life through trust, and be a good person. So James will come back to that idea of us not having control. And then the very last section of the book ends with prayer. And I'm going to argue that prayer is, in a sense, the ultimate form of trust. All right? That prayer is where, do you remember last week I made the distinction between belief and trust? Right? I said, I think at least in the English language, belief tends to sort of push us towards looking at a list of things that we want to do, and we say, yeah, I believe that. I see how that all fits together. I believe it. Trust, I think, tends to, at least I'm going to use those aspects of those words for our conversations. Trust has the idea of handing over your stuff, your destiny, right? Not just simple slavery, but it's actually saying, I know what I'm thinking in my head, and I'm going to think differently and give that to you, all right? And so prayer, I think, is one of the most significant places where that actually happens, where we ball up, where we articulate, where we speak out the most important things to us, and then as we pray, what we're doing is saying, God, these are yours, all right? And one of the things that happens, as an example, I think one of the things that happens is that sometimes prayer can, for people, none of us would do it, but others might do it, it shades out a little bit of handing over, right? Sometimes prayer starts to become a little bit like, I don't know how many of you do mechanic work, but if you're trying to get a big bolt loose and you just can't get enough pressure on it, what do? Does anybody? Cheater bar, right? A cheater bar, right? If your handle's this long and you get a handle that's another 2 feet longer, you can just crank it and go. Of course, what's the problem with a cheater bar? Often. You can break your knuckles, you can break the bolt, etc., etc. The point is sometimes prayer becomes for us as a way to get a little leverage with God, right? Sometimes it becomes more than just a handing over. It becomes a little, if I pray a little extra longer, if I pray 3 or 4 times a week, if I do this in my prayers, and the subconscious idea becomes it's like adding a little bit of extra cheater to the end of that, get a little more pressure. And so I would argue that we want to be careful of that, but that prayer at the end of the day is a place where our trust shines out. All right? And so I'm going to suggest throughout any other talking that we do on the book of James that I'm going to emphasize, by the way, let me just tell you this. Whenever you see, anywhere you see in the New Testament across the board, the word faith, trust, believe. Those are the 3. Anywhere you see those terms, it's all one single Greek word. Okay? It's one word that gets translated 3 different ways. And so you have the right, I would urge you, as you see the words faith or to have faith, believe or to trust or to have trust, or to be trustworthy, when you see those words, keep in your mind, if it's faith, it could be trust. If it's believe, it could be trust. All right? And then I'm going to suggest the distinction that Trust shades towards the idea of handing over. Believe or have faith, for those of us, I think in the English language, shades towards that idea of I look at something and I give assent to it. All right? If you were in a movie, what does it mean? I mentioned again this last week, but what does it mean when someone says the building is burning and you have to jump a giant chasm across and someone says, trust me, right? Trust is that kind of a thing. It's not so much do you believe I can catch you, you calculate it. Trust means can you make that jump? Can you put whatever it is that you value in my hands? So that's the kind of thing that we're going to, or at least I'm going to suggest that when we see in your translation, whichever English translation you have in the book of James, when you see faith, I think faith is one of the most common words. I would urge you every now and then, try out the word trust with that implication that we're talking about. Trust as in handing over what's important to you, letting your need for control, letting go of that, all right? And that's how I'm going to mean it whenever I encounter the word faith or whatever. I'm going to be thinking in James. I think it's one of the most important distinctions to help us get a sense of what's happening in James. All right? So that's the big picture. That's where I think we're going. James is trying to get people to come to grips with, or to be stable in the situations that are in, to be stable and have stability. I think if you look, does anybody in here use the ESV? Okay, you have the ESV. There's another one that's popular, the Holman Standard. Does anybody have that? What does it say in chapter 1, verse 2, when it says, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness is ESV. What does the other version say, the Holman? Okay, endurance. All right. That word, again, can be translated several different ways. I'm going to suggest that endurance or steadiness or the conviction to stay for the long haul, that's what James is working on. So I think James is going to encourage us to have endurance. His point in the book of James is ultimately to lead us all the way to chapter 5, for us to have faith like Job, to endure, to have patience, and to continue on. And then he's going to set up for us, what does it look like? How do we get that faith? Or what does it look like for us? So he's going to found that faith that he wants us to have. Not simply say, trust real hard, but in chapter 1, he's going to give us some ways in which, or he's going to ask us to remember some things that we know about God to help us remember what it means to treat God or think about God in that way. Okay? So, one of the last things that we're going to want to talk about before we get started is this. I'm going to ask you the question, is God fair? I would say yes. All right? I don't have a problem. That wasn't actually a trick question, really. But here's kind of the trick question. Was it fair that Jesus died for your sins? All right? I would argue that we could say, personally, that when you use the word fairness, thinking about it in the sense of everybody, let's put it this way. Did Jesus get what he deserved? Did he deserve to die? He didn't, right? So that was a sense in which he didn't deserve to die. But if you think about it, we could argue about whether that's considered fair. But what is that action when Jesus dies for you, when he didn't deserve it, when he didn't get what he deserved? What's the one thing we can say? Several things we can say about it. Many things. It was good, right? It was good. And it represents what? Love, right? And so, however you think about it, there's an idea in our minds that can creep in sometimes, or it can loom large for us within life to suggest that when things are not going our way, or it's easy for us, especially in America today, it's easy for us to begin to wonder about or to be threatened by things that are not really fair, or threatened by things that we wonder, did we deserve that, or did someone else deserve it? All right? I'm going to suggest that James has at the core of his thought, he's less interested in, or he's more interested in the goodness of God, in that idea that even though there are things that can work out where something happens that you don't deserve, within that, God can be good. God can work with that. All right? I think we'll hit that again in chapter 2, verse 13. Mercy triumphs over judgment. All right? You know, mercy is actually, grace is getting what you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve, right? And yet James says here, mercy triumphs over judgment, in the idea that there is good that can happen in mercy. Would you agree that mercy is good? Let's put it that way, right? Mercy is good. And I'm going to suggest that that's what James is thinking about, that James is thinking about when you live life, or when sort of fairness, or when these kinds of things are your only criterion, it can be hard to understand what God is doing, right? But that God, at the very bottom, when we begin to think about God, that we're trusting, that the basis of our trust is His goodness. All right, let's start with the text in chapter 1, verse 2. Okay? And I'm just basically going to work through the test here, all right? Count it all joy, my brothers. This phrase, that word joy again, is can be a bit troublesome. How many of you have ever wondered, and we'll know who the liars are in church by those that don't put up their hand. How many of you ever wondered just exactly what it looks like to have joy in trials, right? I have, all right. And that has been a bit of a struggle. I'm going to suggest that this is a little bit like, James is not necessarily laying out for you the definition of joy, but he's asking you, he's using joy to force you to think differently about something that you thought about before. Think about an example. If I were to tell you, hey, you know what? When someone cuts you off in traffic, just smile. Right? And then one day we happen to be driving down the street together, and I look over, someone cuts you off, and you just go, right? Maybe you've got a rage problem. And that day I watch, and you go, and you just keep driving. And then I pull you over and I say, you didn't smile. Right? Well, when I ask you to smile, I'm not actually literally saying you have to smile, right? What I'm trying to do is say, hey, let it go. And so even if you don't smile, you can honor what I'm saying. And I'm suggesting that's roughly what James is doing here. He's not trying to lay out that you should have the full joy that's giddy and wonderful, but he's suggesting think differently about trials. Think of trials as a good thing. All right? Think of the good that comes through trials. And again, as we think of the good, I hope that we would take joy, or that we would begin to be moved with the ways in which trials can bring good. But for now, I think that's what we'll say about that. So when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. All right? And I said we're going to say the testing of your trust. When your ability to hand over to God your life, when your ability to take the things that mean everything to you and put those in God's hands, when that is challenged, when that is pushed, when that is put to the test, James says, think of it as good. Take joy in that, because it produces steadfastness. I'm going to suggest that steadfastness, endurance, patience is almost a synonym for wisdom. Wisdom is another way of talking about how do you begin to have an even keel as you move through life? How do you begin to be able to deal with those things that come your way? And so I'm going to suggest, we could argue more deeply, but I'm going to suggest that steadfastness is almost the equivalent of wisdom, and it's almost the equivalent of trust. What does it mean when you have trust? I grew up around horses. My dad had horses, and I remember at different times they were always doing something. They were always in the wire. They were always cut. And I remember one time, one of the horses, we don't know what happened, but it probably leaned against a tree with a big stick going out, and it had a hole in its hip right here. You could get about 3 fingers down inside of it. And so we had to take care of that horse. We lived way out of town, and so he asked me to help him take care. And I remember we had the horse tied up just by the muzzle. It was the halter was tied to the horse trailer, and he asked me and said, hey, come stand next to the horse, right? So I had to stand on the opposite side while he worked on the sore side, and I was supposed to just lean against the horse. Our horses were pretty much trustworthy. They weren't mean like some horses, and so I was leaning against the horse, and we had to squirt that wound out and kind of clean around the edges, and you can guess that wasn't the favorite thing for that horse. And so I remember when he first squirted the stuff inside there, the horse just took off and just swung to the side, not to be mean, but just out of a fight or flight reaction, and just smashed me against the horse trailer, not in a bad way, but just threw me against the horse trailer. And I remember that reaction because it was just instant. We knew it was coming. We knew that it could happen. That's why I was there. And it just threw us. And one of the things I remember at that time, it's always stuck in my mind, is thinking about what I wanted to say to that horse. You just want to say, trust me, right? You just want to communicate and say, look, I'm not trying to do this to hurt you. it hurts, I'd like you to trust me. And I think that's the kind of thing you'd like to be able to say, can you just stand there? I don't have to explain the medical terminology to the horse, but just convey that, can you just take it for a moment for me, because we're trying to help here. Another analogy that I think will help flesh out, has anybody ever heard of the writer Patrick McManus? Anyway, he writes about outdoor things, and he talks about being lost in the woods. He has an article about that. And he talks about two things. He talks about what it's like when you're lost in the woods at night and you start to panic. And so he mentions he's got two panics. One of them is a flat-out ricochet panic. You can guess what that is, right? Where you just take off running and then you hit a tree and then it bounces you and then you run that direction until you hit a tree and then you run until you hit a rock and so on. So you're just ricocheting around the forest, just blind panic running. And then there's another one that he calls the modified stationary panic, which is where you just jog in place screaming with your eyes closed, but at least you're not bouncing off of everything, right? And I'm suggesting that faith, or what James is interested in, is more like the modified stationary panic. He knows that we've got to sort of burn off some energy. We've got to scream a little bit. But the idea is, can you have a sense of what God is doing or who God is that can keep you from flat out ricocheting around the world as you run in panic from those things that are happening? So that's what I'm going to suggest in verse 2 and 3 that James is talking about. That idea of when your faith is tested, when it's pushed, it will help you learn to stay in the modified stationary panic situation. Okay? Verse 4, let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. Probably the biggest thing I want to say here is this. Sometimes this verse, I've heard it used, lacking in nothing, often is taken to mean lacking in anything, right? Kind of like, oh, well, my job's not going that well. I've got this, I've got that. I'm going to suggest that in James, I think lacking in nothing is more, let steadfastness, let the steadiness that comes from trust, let that steadiness bring you to maturity and wholeness, lacking nothing. And I'm going to add something to Scripture here, as dangerous that is, lacking nothing that would drag you down or cause your faith to crumble. All right, so this isn't just, I need a new car next week, I'm lacking a good car, so we're going to pray for that. This is lacking in those things, or that sense of yourself, that sense of who God is that you need to stay stable. All right, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. This is a verse that I think can be a little bit difficult, especially verse 6. If you ask without doubting, you won't get things like that. First thing is, I would suggest that word generously. Again, it says generously in my translation. What does one of the other translations say? God gives liberally. All right? I'm going to suggest that word comes from a different word that actually has at its core the idea of uncomplicatedly or simply. In other words, when God gives, this is where James is starting to flesh out the character of God that we're dealing with. When God gives, it means basically in our terminology today, there's no fine print. There are no strings attached, right? So right off the bat, we're starting to build up our understanding of God, that when you ask, He's not going to be playing games with you. He's not going to be like, give me a little of this, a little of that. He's not going to be, He's going to give simply. You're going to get it. Okay? But there's a problem that arises with that. How many of you have ever been in a difficult situation where you feel like, I'm not exactly sure what God is giving me or what He's doing? Has anybody been there? I'm there. I've been there. Right? And so these problems arise where it's one thing to say God gives simply with no strings attached, but I'll be honest, sometimes it feels like there might be strings attached, or there might be some requirements that He has for me to get this wisdom that I want. There's some requirements that I'm not picking up. All right? And so James is going to address that problem. When we find those situations that push us and sometimes feels like things are maybe a little bit unfair, or we don't have a sense of what's going on. God gives simply. He gives in an uncomplicated way without strings attached. But be sure to ask in trust with no doubting. I hinted at this word doubting last week, but this word doubting is the same word that you'll see, the same Greek word that you'll see in chapter 2, verse 4. in chapter 2, verse 4, it says, have you not made distinctions among yourselves? Have you not made judgments? Have you not decided, have you not categorized people? This person is that category, this person is that category. The heart of this word, it's used in Corinthians chapter 11, in the communion passage, where it says, let a man examine himself. It's the same word. And basically what it means is, at the very heart of it, or at least one of its meanings that I think can help here, is it's like parsing things out, separating things into their meaning, getting everything in order to see how it all fits together. Saying, I know what this is, I know what this is, I know what that is, and so on and so forth. It is also used and translated as waver. And I think those two meanings are going to be more helpful here than doubting. Not because doubting is a bad word, but because doubting, again, pushes us or hints to us, I think, in American English at least, the idea of, I need to believe something. I think wavering or parsing things out fits better with the theme of trust that's going on here. In other words, when you're a person who wavers and says, do you remember we just got told that God gives simply? Or God gives with no strings attached? When we begin to ask those questions, wait, what are the strings here? Wait, what's happening? What should I do? Should I do this? Why is this happening to me? When you begin to ask those questions, when you begin to take what comes in your life and you begin to, what I call, parse it out, you begin to separate it out, this word, you begin to say, well, I see this and I see that. How does that all fit together? We as human beings, we crave everything fitting together, right? I don't know if you've heard this, but I think it happens frequently. I've heard this a lot, at least I heard it growing up a lot. A young person who's very prominent in the church, very good in the youth group, gets killed in a car accident, and people will say something like, well, I think this is why he died, because 2 of his friends got saved, right? We like to balance the scale, right? God takes a really good Christian life, but we get 2 souls in return. I think that's also kind of what's happening here. When you begin to look at everything that God is doing, it's very hard to separate out and say, well, God did this and then He did that and He gave us this and He gave us that and this is what He's doing. That's our first inclination, is to think that way. And I think James is going to suggest that when we ask in trust, if we begin to try and sort out all of the ways in which God could be working, to sort out everything that God is doing, we're going to find ourselves in this situation where we're jumping this way, we jump that way, we're not sure about this, we're not sure about that. And I think James is pushing us into a situation where he's asking, you don't need to go there. Let me ask you a question. You don't have to answer this, but is there ever something that would happen to you where you can imagine yourself as a Christian? Give me the Sunday school answer, right? You know what the Sunday school answer is? You know the story about the boy in Sunday school? Teacher said, it has 2 ears, it has a tail, and it barks. And the boy said, sounds like a dog, but it's got to be Jesus, right? That kind of thing. You got to give the right answer. All right, give me the right answer. Is there ever a point at which you think you could figure out what God is doing and you would do what I call parsing out? You would sort it out and say, okay, He did this, and then there was that, and then He did this. And you could track everything God was doing all the way down to where you'd say, wait a minute, that's no good. Can you ever imagine a situation? Don't say it publicly if you can't. Right? Give me the Sunday school answer. You can't, right? Is there ever a point at which you can imagine figuring everything out and getting there, even if God gave you grace upon grace to see it and see it? Was there ever a point at which you would say, oh yeah, God, you kind of messed up on that one? You wouldn't, right? And so I think James is actually urging us to say, look, trust says that I don't have to know all those things in that step, because in a sense, it doesn't matter anyway. Does that make sense? It doesn't. You're never going to find a place in which the need to know is so significant that you have to know. And so I think James is teaching us not to ask questions. He's not saying you can't ever ask questions, but I think he's teaching us that there is a sense at which you can trust. You can hand over to God the important things of your life, even when you don't know. And when you pursue that kind of knowledge, when you go back and forth, what's happening? Why is this? I think it's this. I don't think it's that. You end up in this state like the waves of the sea where you're tossed back and forth. Do I want to be with God? I'm not sure. I want wisdom, but I don't want it that way, right? I kind of was hoping He would teach it to me this way, not so much that way. When you have that sense, number one, you've forgotten that God is giving simply. He said He would give it, and He's in the process of giving. And the second thing is it makes for an unstable way of moving on. All right, let's talk about verses 9 through 11. We'll go faster here. These verses have given people a lot of trouble. They seem to come out of nowhere. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation, because like the flower of the grass he will pass away. The sun rises with scorching heat, withers the grass, the flower falls, the beauty perishes. So also will a rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. We begin to wonder, both of these are addressed as blessed is In some translations it says, or you see there, verse 9, the brother. Suggests these are Christians, people in the body, right? And so the question becomes, how does this fit in? What does it mean to boast in this exaltation? I'm going to suggest that what this means is James is relying on, or he's using the Christian understanding that God has a special place in his heart for lowliness. God can use the lowly. The last shall be first. He came to save sinners, those kinds of things. And so with that, when you get your priorities straight, like James is asking, when you begin to see that trust is what God values, when you begin to see that God is asking not for you to be a super Christian and know everything, but when he's asking you to stay steady on the basis of his goodness, you can do that whether you're poor or rich, right? It doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich. And so the poor person who can do that, who's like that, can boast. They can brag in a sense of they're doing what God is asking. The rich person, riches, and you remember this is where we go back. I said riches functioned in a little bit of a different way in this culture. Riches were a distraction. They're still a distraction for us. This is where we can, I think, learn. But riches are a distraction. Riches are like when you catch your child or something with their hand in the cookie jar, right? And you've said, don't get in the cookie jar. They broke the cookie jar. And you're talking to them. You're down on your knees talking to them like this. And you're saying, so who did that? Do you remember we talked about it? And they say, do you have anything to say? And they say, look, a squirrel, right? What are they doing? They're distracting from what actually is going on at the moment. And so I think James is saying that's what riches are like. It's fine. Squirrels are cool. Riches are cool. But nobody cares. It doesn't matter when you're talking about what God is asking from you. Okay? And so the rich person should be able to say, yeah, I had some. I lost it. But I can be faithful. Right? And so I think that's what the boasting is there. Verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. I think the crown of life there is actually the crown that is life. The person who perseveres will receive life. For example, a field of green is, in English, a field of green is a field that's green. What is a crown of thorns? It's made out of thorns, right? I think this crown is the crown itself is life. You'll be given the life which God has promised those who love him. And then verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. The word tempted here, this has been troublesome for interpreters forever. The word tempted here is the exact same word as testing in the earlier verses. It's the exact same word. But in this context, it seems like it's focusing more or less on testing of trust and actually the idea of evil drawing us away. And so James is going to warn us as we think about the goodness of God, as we think about how God treats us, remember, don't fall into that trap of saying, wow, I was tested. God is just trying to get me to fail. Right? I don't know if you've ever felt that way. I've heard people say that. God is pushing me, and the idea is he's pushing me to fail. And so James is going to say God doesn't have anything to do with evil. God is not luring you in the sense of testing. God is not interested in pushing you towards evil, watching what you do, saying, I wonder if they'll mess up. I wonder if they'll make a mistake. God is not tempting. Don't fall into that trap that you begin to wonder, is God trying to get me to fall? Okay? And so James is reassuring us, I think, as we've seen in the basis of God's goodness, that God doesn't do that. God has no interest in evil, and God is not interested in pushing people in that direction, okay? Or in the direction of falling. But what happens, verse 14, as we're tempted, we end up seeing the things, we end up having ideas and things that we want, things that are of interest to us. We pursue those, and James said, as we begin to pursue those, as we begin to focus on our desires and the things we want, as those things consume us, we move in a direction that slowly but surely leads us into behaviors, into sin, and sin comes out of that, which leads to death. Okay, so James knows that one of the temptations people face, and again, I would argue, especially in this culture, in this time and place, people were always interested in, what did I do that made God do this? How do I manipulate God this way? How do I get God to do what I want him to do? And so James says the temptation can be to blame God for the troubles that we fall into, but be careful because God is not interested in getting you to fall. Last but not least, verse 16. through 18. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers, for every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of change. Father of lights is troublesome a little bit, but I think basically it means the one who created light. In other words, God is representing light. And the idea is this: with God, when you're dealing with God, this is the last thing, I think. This is where James finishes up, reminding us that God is trustworthy. We can trust God. When He says He will give us the wisdom we need, He will do it. And so this is one last reminder. God is the creator of lights, and like light, there's no shadows. There's no kind of God saying, God has no bait and switch tactics. God has no, well, I got you. Actually, it was over there hidden around the corner behind in the shadows, right? There's one of those the fine print, all right? So James is saying, just like light, God is clear, and He has no changing. You look at one day it's like this, and one day it's like that. God is a straight shooter. All right? It is good that comes from above. And then the last thing, verse 18, I think is finally wrapping up. When we encounter, or when we're living this life of uncertainty, this life when there are struggles that we don't understand, all of these things, when we come across this, it's good to remember, this is part of God's plan. He brought us forth, verse 18, by the word of truth. I think most people take that to be the gospel. He bound us together in the gospel and brought us out that we should be the first fruits of His creatures. The last phrase there, the first fruits of His creatures, I just want to clarify a bit. Sometimes we think the first fruits, we think of all the Holy Spirit we have, all of the blessings that have come to us as Christians. Sometimes we get into our head that it's like a set-apart group. I would suggest this. I don't know how you take it, but I would suggest this, that the first fruits is not necessarily that we're a special people now so much, although we are, but that He has set us aside as a group of people that demonstrate His goodness. All right? That's the key, I think. That as a group of people, it's not focused so much on all the blessings we've received in the Holy Spirit in Christ, but that it's suggesting He has this plan and this body that He's brought together in the gospel. We are the first fruits in the sense of we are lifted up to show what the goodness of God can do. Okay? We represent that goodness for Him. All right. With that, I think I'm finished. I think if we'll be talking again next week, I'd like to continue on, because I think what James is going to do, this first section, is the foundation stone for the rest of the book. As you move forward and as you have become convinced of God's goodness, and as you have allowed that to give you peace, as you have allowed your certainty of His goodness to overcome the uncertainty of this life, as you have done that, as you have moved or are moving into maturity, how does that understanding, when you have said, God, you have everything from me, I am putting my eternal destiny in your hands through the work of Jesus, what does that look like as you actually make choices and decisions in this world? As you actually encounter troubles? How does the goodness of God move you and help you through that? And so hopefully we'll have a chance to do a couple more from there. Let's see, what time is it? I have written a paraphrase. This is basically my sermon in a nutshell. I have paraphrased. I'm not saying that this is the scriptures. This is trying to summarize the sermon as you think about or read James. So this is my stab at James chapter 1, verse 16. My friends, think of it as nothing but good when you fall in with any kind of difficulty, because you already know that when your trust in God is tested, it leads to the steadiness that you need to keep pushing on. As that steadiness grows, it will do its work, and it will lead you to maturity and wholeness without those weaknesses that cause us to crumble so easily. And yet, if any of you do actually lack the wisdom that you need to stay anchored, just ask God for it. He gives what we need simply and without any fine print, and with no snarky comments about the weakness that lies behind the asking. When you ask, though, make sure that you do it with full trust in His goodwill, and with no doubts about His intentions for you. The one who vacillates about whether God is on their side ends up looking just like the waves of the sea, tossed back and forth by the wind. Surely you can see that this back and forth, on and off again way of thinking ultimately means that you won't be able to get a good hold on what He is actually trying to give you. This kind of person is always in two minds and plagued by instability. Do you see? This turns everything on its head. Those who are considered the lowest in society by all normal measures, air quotes, can actually brag about that. For we know how much care God has for people in that position. Rich people can brag about losing all they have because we know how little God cares for wealth. It and the status it brings passes away so quickly, like a delicate flower on a scorching day. The sun rises and the greenery withers, the petals fall off, and the beauty that was so captivating before is just gone. In the same way, upperclassness can fade to lower classness in a heartbeat, right in the middle of doing upper class stuff. Don't lose sight of it. Those who are able to stay steady and grounded in God in the midst of their difficulties are the truly fortunate ones. When they have finally made it to the other side, they will be crowned with the life that God has promised to those who love Him. In the meantime, stay away from those thoughts that would blame God for trouble and would accuse Him of pushing you towards sin and failure. God has no connection to evil, and He never pressures anyone in that direction. Rather, we head that way ourselves when we become consumed by the things that clamor for our attention. We get distracted and drawn away, and we focus more and more on making things work the way we want. Finally, when we can't make it work, and when our cravings are not met, sin is born, and sin snowballs into ways of living that are just plain dead. Please don't be tricked by appearances, dear friends. It's only good, pure and simple, that comes to us in the gifts from above, from the one who created light itself. He doesn't shift like the shadows that constantly move around, sometimes showing, sometimes hiding. There are no gotchas lurking in the fog, no bait and switch shenanigans waiting to pop out at the worst possible moment. God has a plan straightforward and clear, grown out of His own interests and under His control. He has bonded us together in the truth of the gospel, and in doing so, He has set us apart as one of the chief signs of His goodness.